In the cold grip of early 1851, Royse Oatman, his family, and a wagon train of around 80 to 90 hopeful souls set out westward through what is now Arizona. Disagreements soon fractured the group, leaving the Oatmans with a smaller party of about 20 people and a meager 8 wagons. Opting for the Cooke and Kearney route, they followed a southern path down from the Rio Grande. This southern route promised a shorter journey, but it was notorious for its unforgiving terrain and unpredictable weather. Their trek was a relentless battle against hardship. Food dwindled, livestock grew weary, and misfortune seemed to stalk their every step. By the time they reached the dusty town of Tucson, their supplies were nearly gone, and their animals were on the verge of collapse. Tucson, a small desert oasis, offered a tempting opportunity to rest and recuperate. However, the Oatmans, along with the Wilder and Kelly families, yearned for the fertile lands and fresh start promised in California. News of bountiful harvests and a thriving economy fueled their determination. They were worried that lingering in Tucson, relying on future crops that hadn't even been planted, would only lead to starvation for their large families. Fueled by hope and a touch of desperation, they pressed on. Their journey continued northwest, deeper into the unforgiving Arizona desert. By mid-February, they reached a cluster of Pima villages. The Pimas, known for their hospitality, were a beacon of potential assistance. But even the Pimas were struggling with a poor harvest, leaving them with little to spare. Discouraged but not defeated, the Oatmans faced a tough decision. The Wilders and Kellys, unnerved by whispers of Apache raids along the road ahead, opted to stay with the Pimas. Mr. Oatman, a man of resolute spirit, found himself in a precarious situation. His once proud livestock was reduced to a mere 2 pairs of cows and a single, ailing pair of oxen. These animals, the lifeblood of their journey, were barely strong enough to continue. The vast expanse of desert stretched before them, nearly 200 miles to Fort Yuma, and then another unforgiving desert beyond the Colorado River before reaching the promised land of California. Just as despair threatened to engulf them, Dr. LeCount, a seasoned explorer who had recently traversed the Pacific coast, arrived from Fort Yuma. He brought encouraging news. He'd made the journey without encountering any hostile natives or recent attacks. Buoyed by this newfound hope, Mr. Oatman made the difficult decision to continue westward. On March 11th, with whatever meager provisions they could scrounge, the Oatman family set out once more. 7 grueling days passed, and their meager rations decreased by the hour. The family teetered on the brink of starvation. Just when hope seemed lost, Dr. LeCount and a Mexican guide reappeared near a large bend in the Gila River. Recognizing the Oatman's desperate state, Dr. LeCount volunteered to race ahead to Fort Yuma, 90 miles away, to summon help. However, fate had another cruel twist in store. That very night, disaster struck Dr. LeCount and his guide. A band of Native Americans attacked them, stealing their horses and leaving them stranded without supplies. With no choice but to continue on foot or face certain starvation, the guide bravely pushed on towards Fort Yuma to get help. Dr. LeCount, stranded 30 miles from the Oatman camp, desperately scribbled a message on a tree, warning them of the dangers of the Apache attacks. The message's fate remains shrouded in mystery. Did the Oatmans simply miss the warning in their weakened state? Or, as some believe, did Mr. Oatman choose to hide the message, fearing it would crush his family's already fragile spirits? Whatever the truth may be, their situation took a turn for the worse. A violent storm raged through the night, drenching their remaining supplies, soaking their clothes and blankets, and further terrifying their already malnourished animals. This ordeal proved to be the breaking point for Mr. Oatman, a man known for his unwavering optimism. Overcome with despair, he was seen weeping in the confines of their battered wagon. The next day, their struggle continued, but progress was agonizingly slow. Their exhausted animals simply refused to pull the wagon any further. In a desperate bid to move forward, they unloaded the wagon and, with a collective push, inched their way towards a narrow, flat area by the riverbank. Here, they collapsed, utterly spent, their motivation at an all-time low. As they crossed a dried-up streambed, known locally as an arroyo, and wrestled their way through dense thickets of thorny mesquite and ocotillo bushes, the Oatman family reached the base of a steep, rocky cliff. It looked like the toughest obstacle they'd faced yet. They had no other choice but to unpack the wagon again and spend hours hauling their belongings and the wagon itself up the slope. Even with the road being much easier to travel these days, it's hard to imagine how they managed this climb, especially feeling weak and discouraged. Regardless of how they did it, they reached the top, collapsing in exhaustion at the edge of the cliff to catch their breath. Mr. Oatman was a picture of worry. His family couldn't help but notice his constant glances back down the dusty trail they'd just come from. He seemed more discouraged than ever before. As the merciless sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, they were surrounded by an immediate challenge. Endless desert stretched before them, while a maze of mountains loomed behind and to the side. Staying put meant running out of food, while pushing on felt like heading straight into danger. Mrs. Oatman, known for her patience, hope, and strength, kept the children calm and tried to cheer up her husband, but Mr. Oatman was overwhelmed with dread. He kept staring back down the road until a look of pure horror washed over his face. Suddenly, a group of Yavapai natives appeared in the distance, approaching them. Sensing their father's unusual fear, the children grew nervous. Mr. Oatman, however, forced himself to stay calm and assured them that the natives wouldn't hurt them. As the group came closer, Mr. Oatman greeted them warmly in Spanish and offered them a place to sit. They accepted and asked for tobacco and pipes, which he offered them readily. They smoked together for a while, a traditional gesture of peace. Then, the Yavapai politely requested food. Mr. Oatman explained their meager supplies and the long journey ahead, making it clear that they couldn't spare much. Still, he offered them a bit of bread and apologized for not having more. The Yavapai stepped back and huddled together, murmuring amongst themselves. They seemed to be gazing down the road, waiting for someone. Then, without warning, they let out a blood-curdling yell and lunged at the unsuspecting family, brandishing their clubs in a terrifying attack. 14-year-old Lorenzo was the first to be struck down. A blow to the head sent him crashing to the ground. The attackers quickly turned on Mr. Oatman, who fought bravely for a short time before being overpowered. Mrs. Oatman desperately tried to shield her youngest child, her screams for help echoing throughout the canyon. But a few brutal blows silenced both mother and child. In a horrifying whirlwind of violence, everyone except Lorenzo, 16-year-old Olive, and 11-year-old Marianne lay dead or mortally wounded. Olive and Marianne were roughly grabbed by two attackers and dragged away. Lorenzo, dazed from the blow to his head, lay bleeding near the edge of the cliff. He later recounted regaining consciousness to a horrifying soundscape, the attackers' yells mixed with the screams and death throes of his family. When they saw him stir, the attackers rifled through his pockets before tossing him over the cliff. Miraculously, despite the 20-foot fall onto the rocky slope, Lorenzo survived with no serious injuries. Lorenzo later described hearing strange, unsettling sounds that faded eventually, replaced by a beautiful melody that filled him with a strange sense of peace. When he finally came to his senses, he crawled back up the hill. The sight that greeted him was a scene straight out of a nightmare. His family's bodies lay mangled around the broken wagon. Even worse than the gruesome scene was the knowledge that his sisters had been taken captive. Weak from blood loss and overwhelmed with grief, Lorenzo stumbled towards the river, consumed by thirst and fearing the worst. He reached the river eventually, drank deeply, and collapsed into a fitful sleep. Waking with renewed determination, Lorenzo decided to seek help from the Pimo villages, 100 grueling miles away. The next 2 days were a blur of struggle. Weakened and disoriented, he walked, sometimes crawled on the dusty road. He found brief moments of rest wherever he could find shelter, constantly fearing recapture. Hunger, thirst, and a raging fever worsened his condition. Finally, on the brink of giving up, he collapsed, ready to accept his fate. But then, the howling of wolves startled him awake. With shouts and stones, he managed to scare them off, only to find them trailing him again as he continued his trek. A glimmer of hope arrived around noon on the second day. In a dark canyon, Lorenzo stumbled upon 2 Pimo Indians on horseback. Fear gripped him as they aimed their bows at him, but mustering all his strength, he cried out in Spanish, identifying himself as an American and pleading for mercy. Thankfully, his plea struck a chord. Lowering their bows, the Pimos showed compassion, offering him food and water. They advised him to wait while they rode for help. However, haunted by the attack, Lorenzo just couldn't shake the fear of betrayal and moved on shortly after they left. Emerging from the canyon, Lorenzo spotted 2 white-covered wagons in the distance. Recognizing them as American, relief washed over him, and he collapsed from exhaustion. Within an hour, he was found by a bewildered Wilder, who exclaimed, "Lorenzo, my God, what happened?" The wagons belonged to the Wilder and Kelly families, on their way to Fort Yuma. Lorenzo spent the next day recovering amongst the Pimos, regaining enough strength to travel with them to Fort Yuma. After a journey of 8 to 10 days, Lorenzo finally reached a safe haven. For the girls, though, there was no light at the end of the Arizona horizon. The Yavapai attackers, after their brutal assault on the Oatman family, grabbed everything of value from the wagon and scurried across the river, taking Olive and Marianne Oatman with them. The 2 young girls, who had just witnessed the horrific murders of their loved ones, were now forced on a terrifying journey. Barefoot and with no protection from the harsh sun, they were dragged through a cruel and unforgiving landscape. The Yavapai warriors used threats and clubs to keep the girls moving, their feet bleeding from the rough terrain, and their clothes ripped by thorny bushes. Marianne, the youngest sister, struggled with exhaustion, often stumbling and falling behind. The Yavapai, however, had no mercy. Instead of helping her, they beat her and threatened to kill her if she didn't keep up. Feeling utterly defeated, Marianne reached a point where she wished for death as an escape from her suffering. Surprisingly, one of the Yavapai men picked her up and carried her on his back as they continued their long journey into the night, finally stopping for a short rest after many hours. The next day, they encountered another group of Yavapai. One of these had a personal vendetta against white settlers, having lost his brother in a previous clash. Seeing Olive and Marianne, this group charged at them, aiming to kill them. Thankfully, the Yavapai captors intervened, unwilling to lose the potential labor that the girls could provide. After 3 grueling days of travel, covering a vast distance of over 200 miles, they reached a Yavapai village. Their arrival was met with loud shouts, strange songs, and wild dancing. The Yavapai celebrated for days, forcing the girls to witness unsettling and disturbing rituals that filled them with fear and dread. They desperately prayed for death as a way out of this cruel situation. The Yavapai tribe, numbering around 300 people, lived in extreme poverty. For months, Olive and Marianne were treated as slaves, forced to work from sunrise to sunset under harsh conditions. They were barely given enough food to survive and were often forced to find scraps to eat on their own. Secretly, they ate roots and insects while they gathered supplies for their captors, just to stay alive. Marianne, with a naturally weak constitution, began to suffer greatly under the relentless hardships. Despite her pain and suffering, she showed remarkable strength and rarely complained. Whenever they were alone, she would sing hymns with her sister, clinging to the hope that God would one day see their suffering and set them free. By March of 1852, a group of Mojave people, who often traded with the tribe holding Olive and Mary Ann captive, arrived on a visit. During the trading visit, the Mojave chief's daughter, Topeka, noticed how badly Olive and Mary Ann were being treated. She wanted to bring the girls back with her tribe, but the Yavapai initially said no. Topeka wouldn't give up though, and she kept coming back with offers until the Yavapai finally agreed. In exchange for the girls, they got 2 horses, some vegetables, blankets, and some beads. The Mojaves set off with the captive sisters on another brutal journey, a 200-mile trek through scorching deserts and rugged mountains to their village near the Colorado River. This journey proved even more grueling than anything the girls had faced so far. Upon arrival, in a place now called Needles, California, they were once again met not with kindness, but with dancing, loud shouts, and even mockery. There, the family of the Mojave leader, Chief Espinole, welcomed them. Unlike the Yavapai, the Mojave were much better off, and they treated Olive and Mary Ann with kindness, despite the initial meeting suggesting otherwise. The chief's wife, Espineo, and their daughter, Topeka, especially looked after the girls. Olive even spoke fondly of them later in her life. Espineo even gave Olive and Mary Ann their own plots of land to grow crops. However, it didn't take long before life in the Mojave village turned harsh. A poor harvest had left the community with very little food, and many were facing starvation. Mary Ann, already weakened from the previous journey and a lack of proper nourishment, grew thinner and weaker by the day. One evening, as the sisters sat huddled together, Mary Ann sang a hymn their mother had taught them. With a loving look at Olive, she whispered, "I've caused you a lot of trouble, Olive. You'll be sad without me, but at least you won't have to worry so hard when I'm gone." The Mojave watched them silently, but Mary Ann seemed oblivious. A peaceful smile spread across her face as she took her last breath in Olive's arms. Olive was left utterly alone. Traditionally, the Mojaves cremated their dead. However, the chief's wife felt sorry for Olive and convinced her husband to allow Olive to bury Mary Ann according to their own customs. Olive dug a grave in a small patch of land where they often worked and shared memories of their happy home before their terrible ordeal. There, Mary Ann was laid to rest, leaving Olive completely friendless and without any companions. After Mary Ann passed away, Olive slowly adjusted to her new life with the Mojave. She learned their ways and even took on a Mojave name, Oak. She felt so much like part of the tribe that she even hid when white surveyors came to the Mojave land. The Mojave were kinder and lived a more comfortable life than the Yavapai. They even showed their acceptance of Olive by giving her tattoos on her chin and arms, a tradition for their people. These tattoos were believed to help their ancestors recognize them and allow them to enter the afterlife. Olive lived peacefully as Mojave for several years until something happened to break her peace and quiet life. Meanwhile, their brother Lorenzo hadn't given up hope. He tirelessly tried to get help from the military at Fort Yuma, but received no assistance. The only one who seemed interested in rescuing the girls was a regular citizen named Henry Grinnell. From 1853 until the girls were finally freed, Grinnell dedicated himself to finding them. Interestingly, at the same time, expeditions funded by a wealthy New York merchant named Mr. Grinnell were searching the Arctic for a lost explorer. Henry Grinnell, who happened to be the adventurous nephew of the merchant, chose to focus his efforts on rescuing Olive and Mary Ann in Arizona. Despite having limited resources compared to his uncle's well-funded Arctic missions, Henry Grinnell's dedication to saving the girls was just as important. Almost a decade after her capture, things changed for Olive. A Yuma Indian messenger named Francisco arrived at the Mojave village with a surprising message from Fort Yuma. Word had gotten out about a white girl living with the Mojave tribe, and the fort commander wanted her back. They either wanted Olive to return or to understand why she chose to stay with the Mojave. At first, the Mojave people were hesitant. They hid Olive, fearing what might happen to her if she returned to the white community. Some even worried about revenge from the whites if they didn't cooperate. Francisco left for a while but soon came back, this time with a more serious tone. He offered the Mojave people various things for Olive's return, including blankets and a beautiful white horse. He also warned that the whites might attack if they didn't let Olive go. After a lengthy discussion, this time including Olive in the decision-making, the Mojave tribe agreed to the terms. Olive wouldn't be alone on the long journey back to Fort Yuma. Topeka, Chief Espanole's daughter, would accompany her back for the 20-day trip. Before entering the fort, Olive was given some proper clothes to wear by the wife of an army officer, as she had grown accustomed to wearing traditional Mojave attire. Finally, arriving at Fort Yuma, Olive was met by a large and cheering crowd. Her life was about to take another unexpected turn. Thankfully, good news awaited Olive. Upon arrival at the fort, she learned her brother Lorenzo was alive and searching for her and Mary Ann. Their emotional reunion became a major story in the West. After her return, a minister named Royal Stratton found Olive and Lorenzo Oatman. Together, they wrote a book about their ordeal titled Life Among the Indians. The book became a huge hit, selling thousands of copies and making them a lot of money. Stratton even used the money to pay for Olive and Lorenzo's college education. Olive, Lorenzo, and Stratton then went on a nationwide tour, telling their story in lectures across the country. Olive's chin tattoos drew a lot of attention, making her one of the first famous tattooed white women in America. Interestingly, her rise to fame happened around the same time as the women's rights movement began, but Olive never considered herself part of it. After Olive's return, a childhood friend rekindled their bond. This friend claimed Olive secretly married a Mojave man and had children during her captivity. Olive always denied this, but her Mojave nickname, Spansa, sparked questions as experts still debate its exact meaning. Some evidence suggests Olive fully integrated into the Mojave tribe. She received the aforementioned Mojave nickname, a sign of acceptance by the community. However, conflicting stories cloud the picture. Olive later claimed fear of leaving, possibly influenced by the minister who helped write her captivity story, which likely benefited from a dramatic narrative. Historians debate whether Olive and Mary Ann were truly captives. Both girls received Mojave tattoos, a tradition reserved for tribe members to be recognized in the afterlife. Since slaves weren't tattooed, this suggests a different story. Anthropologists believe the Mojave allowed the girls to leave, but feared punishment if they actively helped them escape. Olive's own notes from the 1860s reveal Mary Ann's deep longing for their deceased parents. Olive might have suffered the same fate as her sister, but the Mojave matriarch saved her with a special gruel. Later, Olive spoke fondly of the Mojave in general, considering them kinder than her initial captors. All this considered, it's no wonder Olive seemed to assimilate into Mojave life. She adopted a clan name and nickname, and even hid from white visitors. Believing her family was gone, she likely saw the Mojave as her own family. In 1865, Olive met John Fairchild, a wealthy rancher who had lost his brother in an attack around the same time she was captured. They got married soon after and moved to Texas, where John became a successful banker. They lived a comfortable life in a big house, and Olive even started volunteering at a local orphanage. To hide her tattoos, she wore a veil and generally kept a low profile. Olive and John never had any biological children, but they adopted a little girl named Mammy. Interestingly, John even tried to find and destroy all copies of the book Olive wrote with Stratton, who sadly became mentally ill and passed away a few years later. Many years later, Olive had a surprising encounter. In New York City, she met up with Irataba, a Mojave leader she knew from her time with the tribe. They reminisced about the old days of Mojave life, a reminder of the complex trials Olive had led. Sadly, her brother Lorenzo passed away in 1901. Olive lived on for almost 2 more years, but her journey ended in 1903 when she died of a heart attack at the age of 65. Today, her grave can be found in West Hill Cemetery, located in Sherman, Texas. Olive's story left a lasting mark. In 1915, a town near where she was released from the Mojave, Oatman, Arizona, was named in her honor. This once booming gold rush town is now a popular tourist destination, attracting visitors interested in the Wild West and Olive Oatman's incredible story. Olive's tale remains complex. Was she a prisoner yearning for freedom, or a woman who embraced a new culture? The answer might lie somewhere in between, much like the rest of the stories emanating from the Old West.